On the first Monday of December 1854, snow drifted across the English countryside like torn lace, swallowing roads, hedgerows, and milestones beneath soft white silence. Inside a rattling mail coach, 24-year-old Clara Whitfield hugged a worn leather satchel against her chest, guarding one precious letter that promised honest work, warm meals, and perhaps the first hopeful Christmas since her family's fortunes had collapsed. Once she had studied music beneath respected tutors, believing melodies could shape beautiful futures. Then illness, debt, and loss stripped everything away, leaving only discipline, quiet kindness, and a voice she rarely allowed anyone to hear. She unfolded the employment letter again, smoothing its creases with careful fingers. Ashcombe Castle, it read, where she would serve as Christmas maid until 12th night. She whispered the address beneath her breath, determined not to disappoint the strangers generous enough to hire an unknown woman carrying little besides dignity and hope. The coachman eventually slowed, pointing through the curtain toward towering stone walls rising above the snowy hills. Clara blinked, certain she had misunderstood. The estate looked less like a country house than an ancient fortress, its soaring towers wrapped in winter mist and blue banners hanging motionless above iron gates. Before she could ask another question, the coachman unloaded her satchel, wished her luck, and disappeared into the storm. Standing alone before the immense entrance, Clara felt impossibly small. An elderly butler opened the gate after a cautious knock. His silver eyebrows climbed in confusion as she introduced herself and offered the employment letter. He read it twice, then a third time before looking gently into her anxious face. No Christmas maid had been requested, he explained. Ravensmoor Castle employed a permanent household, and no vacancy existed. Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation. She apologized repeatedly, insisting the mistake must somehow be hers. The butler, though courteous, could offer no explanation beyond suggesting she seek shelter in the nearest village before darkness. Rose reached Clara first. Without hesitation she wrapped both arms around the young woman's skirts and held tightly, burying her face against the wool. Clara instinctively knelt, startled yet gentle. She expected frightened tears, but found only desperate relief. Beatrice stopped beside them, breathing hard from the sprint, while Oliver beamed as though Christmas itself had finally arrived. Beatrice looked directly into Clara's bewildered eyes and whispered, "You're finally here. We've been waiting so long." The words froze everyone. Servants exchanged baffled glances. The butler lowered the letter. Clara searched the children's faces for recognition she could not return. She had never seen any of them before, yet their joy felt astonishingly genuine. Rose refused to loosen her grip even slightly, clutching Clara with silent determination that seemed far older than 5 years. Heavy footsteps echoed across the courtyard. Duke Alexander of Ravensmoor descended the broad stone staircase with measured calm. Tall, impeccably dressed in black despite the season, clean-shaven and strikingly handsome, he carried grief with such practiced discipline that it had hardened into visible distance. His eyes rested briefly upon Clara before moving toward his children. He apologized for their behavior, explaining they had mistaken her for someone else. His tone remained courteous, yet carefully emptied of warmth. Beatrice immediately protested, insisting they had made no mistake. Oliver nodded vigorously. Rose only clung tighter. Alexander knelt beside his youngest daughter and quietly asked her to come inside. She neither moved nor answered. The Duke reached for her hand with infinite patience. The instant his fingers touched her sleeve, Rose released a piercing scream that tore through the snowy courtyard. The sound stunned every servant present. According to the butler's whispered explanation, the child had not spoken since her mother's funeral 2 years earlier, but neither had she cried like this. Alexander withdrew, visibly shaken despite his disciplined expression. Rose buried herself against Clara again, trembling violently until Clara softly stroked her hair and hummed the faintest fragment of an old Christmas carol. The melody barely rose above the wind, yet Rose's sobbing slowly eased. Even the restless horses outside the gates seemed to settle beneath its quiet rhythm. The Duke watched without interrupting, struggling to understand what impossible connection stood before him. Snow continued falling, erasing the road Clara would have needed to travel. The butler quietly informed the Duke that the evening coach had already been cancelled because drifting ice blocked the pass. No traveler could safely leave before morning, perhaps longer if the weather worsened. Alexander looked from the darkening sky to the exhausted young woman whose boots were already soaked through. Duty overcame hesitation. He informed Clara she would remain inside the castle until the roads reopened. She thanked him sincerely, promising she would leave the first moment conditions allowed. Rose immediately shook her head with surprising force, clutching Clara's hand as though fearing another disappearance. Beatrice stepped closer to her father and calmly proposed a compromise. Since the castle needed extra hands during Christmas preparations, Clara could assist the nursery and household temporarily until Christmas Day, when a replacement could surely be found if necessary. Oliver eagerly supported the idea. Alexander studied his children, then Clara, then the silent snowfall gathering upon forgotten decorations that had never been hung. At last he gave one restrained nod. 24 days, he said quietly. No promises beyond Christmas. Relief softened Clara's tired smile, though uncertainty still lingered behind her eyes. She crossed the threshold beside the children, unaware every servant was watching the strange procession with equal measures of curiosity and disbelief. Behind the Duke's composed expression, something almost forgotten stirred, fragile as candlelight beneath winter wind. That night, after the castle finally slept, Beatrice lifted a loose floorboard beneath her bed, withdrew another envelope, and gently unfolded the genuine employment letter addressed to Ashcombe Hall. Oliver whispered that nobody must ever discover what they had done. Beatrice carefully hid the original again, smiled through nervous tears and answered, "She never came to the wrong castle. We simply made certain she found the right one." Morning arrived beneath a pale silver sky, and Ravensmoor Castle awakened without the cheerful bustle that usually accompanied the Christmas season. Servants performed their duties with quiet efficiency, speaking in softened voices as though loud laughter might disturb old ghosts lingering within the stone walls. Clara rose before dawn, determined to earn the unexpected kindness she had received. She tied her simple apron, braided her chestnut hair neatly, and followed the head housekeeper through endless corridors lined with ancestral portraits whose solemn faces seemed to watch every newcomer with careful judgment. Although everyone treated her politely, curiosity followed her like a shadow. She was the mysterious maid embraced by the Duke's children, yet no one understood why. Breakfast in the nursery surprised Clara more than the grandeur of the castle. Beatrice carefully poured tea for her younger siblings before touching her own cup. Oliver deliberately slipped extra jam onto Rose's bread, pretending not to notice when she quietly accepted it. The children behaved with impeccable manners, but the room felt strangely hollow, as though they had memorized happiness without remembering how it truly sounded. Only when Clara entered did warmth briefly brighten their expressions. Beatrice waited until the servants left before closing the nursery door. She crossed to an old painted cupboard tucked beside the fireplace and withdrew a large wooden object wrapped in faded linen. Dust rose gently as she uncovered it, revealing a magnificent hand-painted advent calendar nearly the height of Rose herself. 24 tiny carved doors decorated its surface, surrounded by snow-covered cottages, evergreen branches, golden stars, and angels carrying candles. Though time had dulled the colors, extraordinary craftsmanship still shone through every careful brushstroke. "Our mother painted it," Beatrice said quietly. "She never finished Christmas." Clara traced the intricate edges without touching them. The calendar looked less like a decoration than a labor of profound love. "When Mama became ill," Oliver explained, "she wrote something behind every door. One Christmas surprise for every day until Christmas Eve. But Papa locked it away after the funeral," Beatrice continued softly. "He couldn't bear seeing it." Rose gently rested her tiny hand upon the painted image of a robin perched near the first door. "We found it last winter," Oliver admitted. "But we were afraid to open it alone." Beatrice looked directly at Clara. "Will you help us?" Clara hesitated only briefly. She understood grief well enough to recognize sacred things hidden beneath silence. Finally she nodded. "Only if we honor your mother's wishes exactly as she intended." 3 smiling faces answered her. Beatrice carefully opened the first tiny door. Inside rested a folded piece of cream-colored paper, the ink slightly faded but beautifully preserved. In elegant handwriting, the late Duchess had written only one sentence. "Bake ginger stars with everyone who can still make flour fly." Oliver laughed before anyone else did. Within the hour the castle kitchen, usually ruled by order and precision, transformed into cheerful disorder. The elderly cook protested dramatically when flour covered her polished table, yet secretly slipped extra cinnamon into the dough. Clara showed Rose how to press little star-shaped cutters into the soft mixture while Oliver deliberately dusted himself white enough to resemble a snowman. Even Beatrice forgot her constant dignity long enough to flick flour onto her brother's nose. For the first time in years, childish laughter echoed beneath Ravensmoor's ancient ceilings. Standing unnoticed outside the kitchen doorway, Duke Alexander paused. He had entered intending to request silence. Instead he found his children smiling. His gaze settled upon Clara kneeling beside Rose, patiently helping tiny fingers decorate ginger stars with sugared almonds. He turned away before anyone noticed him watching. That evening Beatrice opened the second little door. "Hang evergreen where sorrow cannot reach." The children looked uncertain. "There isn't any greenery," Oliver whispered. "There is," Clara answered gently. "The forest never forgets Christmas." Wrapped warmly against the evening cold, they gathered pine, holly, and ivy beneath towering snow-covered trees. Clara taught them how villagers wove simple garlands from ordinary branches instead of expensive decorations. Back inside, they quietly transformed forgotten windows, stair rails, and nursery doors with fragrant greenery. Slowly, the castle itself seemed to breathe differently. Day after day, another tiny door opened. One instructed them to feed hungry birds before feeding themselves. Another asked them to deliver anonymous gifts to weary servants. Another encouraged everyone to read stories aloud beside the fire. Each simple instruction revealed another piece of the Duchess's generous heart. The children stopped counting days. They began anticipating memories. On the seventh evening, Beatrice discovered something entirely unexpected. Behind the tiny painted door rested several pages of unfinished sheet music. Across the top, in graceful handwriting, appeared a title: Our Christmas Carol. The melody ended abruptly halfway through the final verse, the ink trailing into blankness where the Duchess's strength had failed. Silence filled the nursery. Clara gently lifted the fragile pages. "It deserves an ending," she whispered. That night, after everyone retired, Clara slipped quietly into the music room. Moonlight spilled across polished ivory keys coated with 2 years of untouched dust. She cleaned them carefully before placing the unfinished composition upon the stand. The melody possessed remarkable tenderness, filled with hope rather than sorrow. She played it once, then again, searching not to replace another woman's music, but to understand where her heart had intended the song to travel. Outside the partially open doorway stood Alexander. He recognized every note. His wife had composed it during long nights beside the nursery fireplace. He had never heard anyone play it since her death. Unable to interrupt, he remained hidden within the darkness while Clara softly experimented with the unfinished passage, never forcing the melody, allowing it to unfold naturally as though listening instead of composing. Several evenings later, the 12th little door carried only 4 words: "Open the winter garden." Oliver's eyes widened. No one goes there. The conservatory stood abandoned behind locked glass doors at the eastern wing, exactly as the Duchess had left it. Dead vines twisted across iron arches. Empty flowerbeds slept beneath dust. Frost clouded every window pane. "It was Mama's favorite place," Beatrice whispered. The children looked toward Clara. She smiled. "Then perhaps it has simply been waiting." Armed with lanterns, brooms, watering cans, and impossible optimism, they began restoring the forgotten sanctuary one quiet evening after another. Servants gradually joined without invitation. The gardener repaired broken glass. The cook donated herb seedlings. Housemaids polished cracked marble benches until they reflected candlelight again. Together they coaxed warmth back into the sleeping conservatory. Clara planted paperwhites and Christmas roses exactly where winter sunlight lingered longest, believing beauty often required patience more than certainty. One evening, while Clara played the unfinished carol upon an old upright piano wheeled carefully into the restored garden, Rose wandered toward a single white flower pushing through dark soil. She pointed with trembling fingers. Then, in a tiny voice scarcely louder than falling snow, she whispered, "Mama." Everything stopped. Beatrice gasped. Oliver stared in disbelief. A gardener quietly crossed himself. The word floated beneath the glass ceiling like the first swallow returning after endless winter. Beatrice ran through the corridors searching for her father. Alexander arrived breathless, fearing disaster. Instead he found his youngest daughter standing beside Clara, one hand resting upon a blooming paperwhite, while the unfinished Christmas melody drifted softly through the candlelit conservatory. Rose looked toward him. She did not speak again, but she smiled. For the first time since the funeral, hope entered Ravensmoor Castle before Christmas itself. The days between Rose's first whispered word and Christmas Eve passed with the quiet certainty of snow gathering upon ancient rooftops. Ravensmoor Castle no longer felt imprisoned by mourning. Evergreen garlands climbed staircases once left bare. Candles glowed warmly behind leaded windows each evening. The restored winter garden filled with the delicate fragrance of paperwhites, while the unfinished Christmas carol slowly found its missing notes beneath Clara's patient hands. Servants smiled more freely. The children laughed without glancing over their shoulders, as though fearing joy itself might vanish. Even Duke Alexander no longer hurried past the nursery whenever music drifted into the corridors. He often paused outside unseen, listening with an expression balanced delicately between memory and hope. Yet beyond the castle walls, another world prepared for Christmas with different ambitions. Every winter the nobility gathered at Ravensmoor Castle for one magnificent Christmas ball, a tradition older than Alexander's family itself. Although he had cancelled nearly every celebration after his wife's death, political obligations could not be ignored forever. This year invitations had quietly been sent weeks before Clara's unexpected arrival. Dukes, earls, bishops, judges, military officers and wealthy landowners would soon fill the grand ballroom. Rumors had already spread across neighboring counties that Ravensmoor had begun celebrating Christmas once more. Society wanted answers. The first carriage arrived beneath falling snow 3 days before Christmas. Among the distinguished guests stepped Countess Vivian Hargrove. She possessed extraordinary elegance without warmth, every movement polished by years of aristocratic perfection. Her emerald velvet gown shimmered beneath the winter sunlight, and her smile carried the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to receiving exactly what she desired. 4 months London's drawing rooms had confidently predicted that Alexander would eventually marry her. Their families shared old alliances. Their estates bordered one another. On paper, the match appeared inevitable. Vivian expected to find a grieving duke still hidden behind silence. Instead, she discovered something entirely different. The children greeted visitors with genuine smiles. Rose walked beside Clara holding her hand. Oliver eagerly carried evergreen decorations toward the entrance hall. Beatrice laughed while directing servants hanging ribbons across the staircase. And Alexander was watching Clara from the opposite side of the hall with quiet admiration he himself had not yet fully recognized. Vivian noticed immediately. She had spent too many years reading drawing rooms not to recognize the first fragile signs of affection. That evening she joined Alexander beside the library fire. "You seem happier," she observed lightly. He looked toward the doorway where distant laughter echoed from the nursery. "The children are happier. And the new maid deserves the credit?" "She deserves honesty," he replied calmly. "Nothing more." Vivian smiled politely. Inside, suspicion had already begun sharpening into strategy. The following morning she requested a private carriage to the nearby employment agency. Her questions appeared harmless. She wished only to verify references for the young maid temporarily residing at Ravensmoor. The clerk willingly produced records. Vivian's practiced eyes noticed the inconsistency immediately. The agency ledger clearly assigned Clara Whitfield to Ashcombe Hall, not Ravensmoor Castle. The copied address upon Clara's employment letter had been altered. Someone had changed it. Vivian requested every available document before returning quietly to the castle. She spent hours comparing handwriting, dates, signatures, and official seals. By sunset she believed she understood everything. A clever young woman from reduced circumstances had forged her destination, entered one of England's wealthiest households, won the affection of vulnerable children, and slowly captured the Duke's attention. Vivian never considered another possibility. She saw only calculated ambition because that was precisely the weapon she herself would have chosen. Preparations for the Christmas ball transformed Ravensmoor into dazzling splendor. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors. Towering evergreen trees filled the entrance gallery with the scent of pine. Musicians rehearsed beneath painted ceilings while servants hurried through corridors carrying silver trays, floral arrangements, and countless candles. Clara remained almost invisible throughout the bustle, helping wherever needed before quietly returning to the nursery each evening. She never imagined she had become the subject of whispered conversations among aristocratic guests. Many wondered why the Duke's children refused anyone's company except hers. Others noticed Alexander's gaze lingering whenever she entered a room. By Christmas Eve, speculation had become impossible to ignore. As twilight deepened into velvet darkness, elegant carriages stretched for nearly half a mile beyond the castle gates. The ballroom blazed with golden light reflected across polished mirrors and crystal glass. Music swelled beneath vaulted ceilings. Ladies shimmered in embroidered silk. Gentlemen stood in immaculate evening coats discussing parliament, harvests, and politics. Clara had intended to remain entirely absent. Instead, the head housekeeper insisted she assist briefly in the gallery before retiring upstairs. To avoid drawing attention, Clara wore a simple ivory gown borrowed from the housekeeper, modestly altered to fit her. Its plain elegance only emphasized her natural grace. When she entered carrying fresh candles, conversation briefly faltered. Alexander looked up. For one suspended heartbeat the crowded ballroom disappeared. He saw only the woman whose quiet kindness had restored music to his children. Without fully considering the consequences, he crossed the polished floor toward her. Every noble eye followed. He stopped before Clara. "Miss Whitfield," he said softly, "would you honor me with this dance?" Silence spread across the ballroom. An unmarried duke. A common maid. The first dance of Christmas. No one breathed. Clara stared in astonishment. "My lord, you may refuse." She searched his face. Instead of command she found sincerity. With trembling composure she placed her hand in his. The orchestra resumed. Together they stepped into the center of the ballroom. Alexander guided her gently, never allowing the difference in rank to appear upon his expression. Clara moved with surprising elegance, the forgotten discipline of her musical education revealing itself through every graceful turn. Around them whispers multiplied, but the children watched from the staircase with shining pride. Rose even clapped softly. Halfway through the waltz another voice shattered the music. "Stop." Every violin fell silent. Countess Vivian stood near the orchestra holding several folded documents. "I deeply regret interrupting," she announced clearly, "but I cannot allow Ravensmoor's honor to be compromised through deception." Uneasy murmurs rippled across the room. Vivian approached the Duke. She handed him the agency records. "The lady dancing with you was never employed here. Her assignment belonged elsewhere." She unfolded Clara's employment letter beside the official register. "The destination has been altered." Gasps filled the ballroom. The differences were unmistakable. Another servant entered timidly from the entrance hall. Vivian gestured toward her. "This is Miss Pruitt, the genuine maid assigned to Ashcombe Hall." Clara's face drained of color. She accepted the documents with shaking hands. The address. It truly had been changed. Not by weather. Not by accident. By someone. Alexander looked into her stunned eyes. "Did you know?" The question pierced more deeply than accusation. She opened her mouth. Nothing came. How could she defend herself against evidence she had never imagined existed? The ballroom seemed to close around her. Ashamed beyond words, Clara stepped backward, unable to meet the children's frightened faces. Before she could flee, the elderly butler calmly walked forward from among the servants. He regarded Miss Pruitt for several thoughtful moments. Then recognition settled across his weathered features. "I remember you," he said quietly. "You served the Countess in London 3 winters ago." Miss Pruitt's confidence collapsed instantly. The ballroom became perfectly still. Vivian's composed smile flickered for the very first time. And Alexander slowly lifted his eyes from the forged letter to the woman who had presented it, realizing that the greatest deception of the evening might not belong to Clara at all. The ballroom remained silent long after the butler recognized Miss Pruitt. Every aristocrat present understood the implication immediately. A respectable lady had attempted to place her own servant inside another noble household under false pretenses. Miss Pruitt, unable to withstand dozens of accusing eyes, admitted through trembling tears that Countess Vivian had promised generous payment if she quietly reported every private conversation within Ravensmoor Castle before any marriage negotiations began. Vivian's carefully polished composure shattered. She denied manipulation, blamed misunderstanding, and attempted to recover her dignity, but suspicion spread faster than any explanation. One by one, distinguished guests stepped away from her. Alexander requested that she leave his home before midnight. Without another word, she gathered her cloak and departed through the great doors, carrying her humiliation into the falling snow. The victory brought no celebration. Clara remained standing exactly where the music had stopped, still holding the forged employment letter. Vivian's disgrace proved only that another scheme had existed. It did nothing to explain why Clara's address had truly been changed. Every eye continued drifting back toward the altered document in her hands. Alexander wanted to reassure her, yet honesty prevented empty comfort. Someone had rewritten that letter. Until the truth emerged, uncertainty stood between them like an invisible wall. Clara quietly returned the paper to him. "I swear before God," she whispered, "I never changed a single word." "I believe you wish that to be true," Alexander answered gently, though sorrow weighed every syllable. The difference between belief and certainty pierced her heart. She curtsied with trembling grace, excused herself from the gathering, and disappeared upstairs before anyone noticed the tears she refused to shed publicly. The children tried following her, but the housekeeper gently guided them back. Christmas music resumed only because tradition demanded it, yet every note sounded hollow. Alexander remained among his guests until the final carriage departed, fulfilling obligations while his thoughts followed the young woman hidden somewhere within the silent castle. Long after midnight he carried the forged letter into his private study, lit a single candle, and examined every line again beneath its steady flame. He compared signatures, official seals, dates. Nothing revealed itself. Then his attention lingered upon one unusually rounded capital letter. His heartbeat slowed. He had seen that shape countless times before. He opened a drawer and removed several copybooks containing Beatrice's lessons from the previous spring. Patiently he laid them beside the employment letter. Every carefully pressed capital, every looping S, every habit of pressing too firmly at the beginning of words matched with painful familiarity. Alexander closed his eyes. The answer had been living inside his own nursery. He climbed the staircase before doubt could interrupt certainty. The children waited awake together despite the late hour. Oliver immediately recognized the letter in his father's hand. Color vanished from his face. Rose looked anxiously between them, sensing trouble she could not fully understand. Beatrice stood very still beside the fireplace, shoulders straight, as though she had been expecting this moment since Clara first entered the castle. Alexander spoke quietly. "Tell me everything." Silence stretched painfully. Finally Oliver burst into tears. "I'm sorry." Beatrice reached for his hand before looking back at her father. "I changed the address." The confession entered the room like winter wind. Alexander neither shouted nor interrupted. He simply listened. 2 winters earlier, after the Duchess's funeral, the family had held a memorial service inside the village church. Snow had fallen so heavily that hired singers refused to travel dangerous roads. Guests waited awkwardly while embarrassed clergy debated canceling the music entirely. Then an unknown young woman, scarcely older than Beatrice herself seemed now, stepped quietly from the back pew. She apologized for her boldness and asked permission to sing instead. That stranger had been Clara. She sang the Duchess's favorite Christmas carol without accompaniment. Her clear, gentle voice filled the cold church until even strangers wept. Rose, who had not stopped crying for days after losing her mother, became perfectly still while listening. When the final note faded, the mysterious singer slipped away before anyone learned her name. "We never forgot her," Beatrice whispered. Rose smiled that day, Oliver added through tears. It was the last time before she stopped speaking. For 2 years the children searched whenever they visited nearby villages, hoping to recognize the young woman whose song had carried warmth into their darkest morning. They never found her. Until autumn. Oliver had accompanied the butler to collect supplies from the village and wandered briefly into the employment agency while waiting. A register lay open upon the desk. There, beside an application for Christmas work, appeared one familiar name copied from the memorial program preserved inside their mother's prayer book. Clara Whitfield. Oliver rushed home. The children devised a plan neither fully understood nor appreciated. Beatrice intercepted the employment letter before the morning post reached its destination. With painstaking care she copied every line, changing only one address. Ashcombe Hall became Ashcombe Castle. "We didn't steal her," Beatrice said, her voice trembling despite remarkable courage. "We borrowed a chance." Alexander stared silently. "You understand what you risked?" "Yes." "You deceived innocent people." "Yes." "You placed Miss Whitfield's reputation in danger." Tears finally escaped Beatrice's determined eyes. "I know." Oliver buried his face in his sleeves. Rose quietly crossed the room and hugged her sister. Then Beatrice spoke the truth she had protected for weeks. "We didn't bring her here to become our maid." She looked directly into her father's grief-worn eyes. "We brought her because we remembered how Mama sounded when Clara sang." Oliver nodded. Then Rose laughed again. Beatrice continued. "After she arrived, Rose spoke. You smiled. The servants smiled. The castle smiled." She swallowed hard. "And you fell in love with her." Alexander could not answer, because every word was true. He left the nursery carrying the letter with unsteady hands and walked directly toward Clara's room, determined to explain everything before dawn. He found the bed neatly made, the fire extinguished, the wardrobe empty. Upon the small writing desk rested only 3 things: the completed Christmas carol, a folded farewell note, and the tiny wooden key belonging to the final unopened door of the Advent calendar. His hands trembled as he unfolded Clara's letter. She thanked the family for allowing her to witness love returning to Ravensmoor. She insisted the children must never be blamed, believing the altered address had ultimately become a blessing. She could not remain while scandal surrounded the household she cherished. Their happiness mattered more than her own. Beneath the note she had written one final sentence. Please open the last door together, exactly as she intended. Alexander carried the key into the nursery. The children gathered silently around the great painted calendar. With careful hands he unlocked the 24th door. Inside rested a folded page written by the late Duchess herself. My dearest love, it began, if one day someone teaches our children to laugh again, do not mistake that miracle for betrayal. Loving them beside another kind heart will never mean you loved me less. Promise me grief will not become the final guardian of this house. Open the gates. Welcome joy. And when Christmas returns, follow it. No one spoke. Outside, dawn's first pale light settled across untouched snow. Then Alexander quietly reached for his coat, while three hopeful children hurried to pull on theirs, because somewhere beyond the frozen road, the woman who had healed their family believed she was walking away forever. Christmas Eve unfolded beneath a sky the color of pearl, while thick snow continued drifting across the winding roads that stretched between Ravensmoor Castle and the neighboring villages. The stable hands hurried to prepare the finest sleigh, expecting the Duke to send trusted servants after Clara. Instead, Alexander strode into the courtyard already fastening his gloves, determination replacing the hesitation that had governed him for 2 long years. Before anyone could object, he took the reins himself. I'll drive, he said simply. The head groom hesitated. Your Grace, the roads are dangerous. So is waiting. Behind him, 3 bundled children hurried across the snow. Beatrice climbed into the sleigh carrying the Duchess's letter safely tucked inside her coat. Oliver held the completed Christmas carol against his chest as though protecting something alive. Rose carried only a tiny paper white blossom from the winter garden, refusing to leave it behind. Without another word, Alexander urged the horses forward. The sleigh surged through the falling snow. Every mile felt painfully slow. The first coaching in had not seen Clara. Neither had the second. At a crossroads nearly buried beneath fresh drifts, an elderly farmer recognized the description of a young woman carrying one worn leather satchel. She boarded no coach, he explained. Storm closed the northern pass. Last I heard, she's waiting at the Holly Oak Inn until morning. Alexander thanked him and drove harder. The bells on the harness rang sharply through the silent countryside while snow whipped against their faces. Inside the sleigh nobody spoke. Each child carried the same fear. What if she left before they arrived? What if she believed she truly did not belong? What if Christmas ended exactly the way it had begun, with another goodbye? Nearly an hour later, the warm glow of lanterns appeared through the storm. The Holly Oak Inn stood beside the frozen road, crowded with stranded travelers waiting for weather gentle enough to continue their journeys. Alexander barely waited for the horses to stop before stepping down. He opened the inn door. Warm air scented with pine smoke and fresh bread rushed toward him. Conversations filled the room. A violinist quietly played near the fireplace. Then he saw her. Clara sat alone beside the hearth, her small satchel resting at her feet. She had removed her gloves to warm her hands around a simple cup of tea. The firelight painted soft gold across her face, yet sadness lingered quietly within her eyes. She looked peaceful. Not because she wished to leave, because she believed she had no choice. Before Alexander could speak, a tiny blur rushed past him. Rose. The little girl crossed the crowded room with astonishing speed. Clara. Every conversation stopped. Rose threw both arms around her once more. This time she did not remain silent. Looking directly into Clara's astonished face, she spoke with a clear voice that carried through every corner of the inn. Please come home. Tears instantly filled Clara's eyes. Rose smiled through her own. It's your home too. The room fell utterly silent. Travelers who knew nothing of Ravensmoor instinctively understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. An elderly woman quietly wiped her eyes. The violinist lowered his bow. Even the innkeeper remained motionless behind the counter. Oliver and Beatrice reached Clara moments later, embracing her from either side. We're sorry, Oliver whispered. We should have told you, Beatrice said through tears. Everything was our fault. Clara gently held both children. I already forgave you before I knew. Alexander slowly approached. For several moments neither spoke. Everything important waited between them. Finally he removed the Duchess's letter from his coat and placed it carefully into Clara's hands. I know everything. She looked down in confusion. The children told me. Understanding slowly dawned across her face. They changed the address. They did. I'm so sorry. He gently shook his head. For weeks I believed someone had stolen Christmas from this family. His voice softened. It wasn't stolen. It was returned. Clara lowered her eyes. I still brought scandal upon your house. No. You doubted me. I doubted what I couldn't explain. And now I know the truth. She remained silent. Alexander took another careful step. The letter brought you to Ravensmoor. He smiled faintly. But everything afterward belonged entirely to you. You restored the winter garden. You completed my wife's final song without erasing a single note of her heart. You gave my children permission to become children again. You gave Rose back her voice. His own voice faltered. And somehow, you gave mine back too. Clara could no longer hide her tears. I never wanted to replace her. I know. I couldn't. I would never ask you to. He carefully unfolded the final page written by his late wife. I almost spent the rest of my life believing loving again meant forgetting. He looked toward the children. They reminded me that love is not divided. It grows. He offered Clara the letter. She understood that before I ever could. Clara slowly read the Duchess's final blessing. By the final sentence, tears blurred every word. She closed the letter carefully against her heart. Alexander drew one slow breath. I have spent 2 years closing every door inside Ravensmoor. You opened every one without forcing a single lock. My children chose you long before I had the wisdom to. He lowered himself onto one knee before her. The crowded and gasped. No duke in living memory had ever knelt publicly before a woman of humble birth. I cannot change the road that brought you to my gates. I cannot erase the pain of that ballroom. But I can choose every road that comes after. He looked directly into her eyes. Come home. Not as our Christmas maid. Not as our governess. Come home because my children already love you. Because I love you. And because the castle has never truly belonged to anyone else since the day you walked through its gates. Silence lingered, only a heartbeat. Then Clara smiled through tears brighter than the fire itself. Yes. The children burst into joyful laughter. Rose clapped excitedly before hugging both adults together. The travelers erupted into applause so heartfelt that even Alexander laughed aloud, surprising himself as much as everyone else. Together they returned through softly falling snow toward Ravensmoor Castle. When the sleigh entered the courtyard, every servant stood waiting beneath lantern light. No formal announcement had been made. Yet somehow everyone understood. The housekeeper smiled openly. The gardener removed his cap. Even the stern cook pretended to complain while secretly crying. Beatrice led Clara toward the restored winter garden with a silk ribbon gently covering her eyes. One last surprise, she whispered. Inside, hundreds of candles illuminated the glass conservatory. The Christmas roses had opened exactly on schedule. Paperwhites filled the air with delicate fragrance. Snowflakes drifted across the glass roof above like quiet stars descending from heaven. At the center stood the old piano. Alexander guided Clara onto the bench. When the ribbon was removed, she simply stared. It bloomed, she whispered. It waited for you, he answered. He sat beside her. Without speaking, he began playing the completed Christmas carol. His hands hesitated only once before Clara gently placed hers beside his upon the keys. Together they finished the melody neither could have completed alone. The children began singing. Their clear voices echoed beneath the glass ceiling while servants quietly joined from the doorway. It became impossible to tell where the Duchess's unfinished composition ended and Clara's final verses began. Past and future flowed together inside one beautiful song. When the final note faded into peaceful silence, Beatrice stepped forward carrying a small hand-carved wooden box. We made one more door, she said softly. Door 25. Clara opened it. Inside rested the late Duchess's wedding ring beside a folded note written in Beatrice's careful handwriting. For the woman Mama hoped we would someday find, the one who made us laugh again. Alexander gently lifted the ring. My wife trusted that happiness would someday return. He looked into Clara's shining eyes. So do I. He slipped the ring onto her finger. No elaborate speech remained necessary. The answer already lived within every smile surrounding them. 1 year later, another Christmas Eve found Ravensmoor Castle brighter than anyone remembered. Children's laughter echoed through every hallway. Music drifted freely from open windows. In the winter garden, Clara, now Duchess of Ravensmoor, hung a newly painted advent calendar beside the original one her predecessor had lovingly created. This calendar held 24 little doors. And one extra. Rose, now happily chattering from sunrise until bedtime, looked curiously at the final tiny door. "What is that one for?" Clara smiled, resting a gentle hand upon the curve of her expectant belly while Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She looked first at the children, then at the man beside her, before answering with quiet joy. "For someone who's finally almost here." Beyond the glowing glass walls, snow continued falling over the same castle everyone once believed she had reached by mistake. Yet from the very beginning, the wrong castle had always been the right home, and the words spoken by 3 hopeful children on that snowy morning had never been mistaken at all. They had simply arrived a little earlier than everyone else understood. "You're finally here."